I spent the weekend binging on all 10 episodes of Lena Dunham's new Netflix series, Too Much. She's the writer, the creator and the director. She also has a supporting role in it, playing the sister of the main character, but she's not the star of this show. The show is semi-autobiographical. It's about an American woman in her 30s who leaves New York after a bad breakup to move to London, where she meets this musician and they fall in love. It's a rom-com. It's got a phenomenal supporting cast, of which Lena Dunham is one. She's not the main character. The main character is played by an actress called Megan Stalter, who you might know. She plays Kayla in Hacks. She's kind of the assistant. She looks a lot like Lena, and she sort of acts a little bit like Hannah Horvath in Girls. We're going to talk about Too Much more on the show on Friday, but today we wanted to talk about Lena. Girls was obviously her breakout hit. She was only 25 when she wrote and directed and was the showrunner on that show. And she was everywhere for the 6 seasons that Girls was around. It was the sort of the mid-2010s. And we just wanted to have a little bit of an explainer about her place in the culture and why you might remember she seemed to be so controversial back then, until she basically was so controversial she imploded and disappeared. And she's done a lot of things since then, but she also did move to London about 5 years ago and met this musician and got married, and he's the co-creator of this show with her. And I just wanted to recap, because there are some people who will know everything about Girls and a lot of people are rewatching it, but others are a bit like, I don't really remember much about her.
A lot of people have forgotten but know that Lena Dunham was somewhat exiled, whether that was like a self-appointed exile or she was sort of
a lot of drama,
cast out from Hollywood. But I don't think people can remember the point at which she was sort of
What did she do?
thrown out.
And who was she, Amelia, for those who are a bit vague?
Yeah, so I actually remember the very first time I heard about Lena Dunham, and it was in 2010, and I was working at the New Yorker magazine, and we had these ideas meetings every week, and people would bring ideas about things that people were talking about, pitch them essentially as stories. And this extremely switched on, very, very cool young man came to the meeting, and he always had the best ideas. And he came to the meeting and he said, there's this young director called Lena Dunham, and she has written and directed a movie called Tiny Furniture. And I thought, that is such a strange name for a movie. And because I am evidently not an especially good magazine editor, I passed on that story, which is sort of like when all those people passed on signing the Beatles when they were like shopping their first album around. Because very shortly after that, she did become extremely famous. And it's easy to forget quite how exciting it felt to watch that ascent happen. So Tiny Furniture, it became very famous very quickly because in addition to being a very interesting sort of movie about a woman coming of age in New York, there was a sex scene which took place in an abandoned tunnel in Brooklyn.
Oh.
And there was this frank depiction of sex that we had never seen before. I can't stress how revolutionary this was.
In what way?
It was a sex scene in an abandoned tunnel. It was not glamorous. The parts did not fit together like Tetris, which is often how we see sex scenes and certainly used to see sex scenes on film. It felt very real and gritty and quite literally dirty because it was in an abandoned tunnel. And there was something incredibly exciting about seeing a young woman's vision of sex, which is sometimes profoundly unfulfilling. Sometimes it doesn't always end in orgasms. And in fact, sometimes the man can be a real jerk afterwards. And you hadn't really seen any of that from a woman's point of view. So if I sound excited, it was because it did feel like a new way of thinking about being a young woman. Yeah. And so then, unsurprisingly, shortly after that, she teamed up with Judd Apatow, who was everywhere at the time, the director of The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and This Is 40 and other movies like that. Sort of, you could argue, taking that same no-holds-barred approach to men. He teamed up with Lena Dunham, who was doing it for women's lives. And then they made together Girls, which premiered, as you said, Mia, when she was just 25 in 2012. everyone called girls the millennial generation's answer to Sex and the City. It was sort of everything Sex and the City wasn't. It was also about 4 women in New York, but these 4 women were really going through messy struggles. It wasn't glamorous. They were not drinking Cosmos in bars. They were kind of like taking gin shots in their sort of like hoveled apartments in Brooklyn. It felt very different. It had lots of critical acclaim, millions of viewers. The second season was greenlit before the first was even over. But then, even as Girls was this huge touchstone moment, over the course of the 6 seasons that it was on, I remember that you started to feel Lena Dunham slip down the mountain. As we so often do to women, we build them up, and she became the voice of her generation. People often quote this line from the pilot of Girls where her fictional character, Hannah Horvath, says,
"I don't want to freak you out, but I think that I may be the voice of my generation. Or at least a voice of a generation."
But in fact, over time, she became the voice of millennials. And
can we talk about her body, though? And I just think we'd be remiss not to, because part of what was so transgressive about that show and about her starring in it is that, just like you said about the sex scenes, she didn't have the kind of body we were used to seeing. Even in the sex scenes on Sex and the City or on shows like Friends, the female lead was always a size 0 and looked a certain way, and she didn't. And it's so funny looking back now, because like a lot of people, I'm rewatching Girls, and it's almost like when you rewatch Bridget Jones and all of the talk about how fat Renee Zellweger was, and there was all this talk about Lena Dunham and how brave she was, or how shocking it was to see her having sex and not talking about her body. Her body was incidental. And when you look back now, she'd be what, a size 10 to 12 maybe?
Yeah, there was even an episode of Girls where she has this kind of sexy weekend with a stranger that she meets, and he's very, very handsome.
Yes.
And there was this whole discourse, because this is what we did back then, where everyone was saying that it was an unrealistic plot because he was too good looking for her.
Yeah.
She was this lightning rod in that she was being criticised by the far right for being what they saw as not conventionally attractive or too woke or whatever. But then I think she pissed the left off to the same degree, and often because the show was criticised for not being diverse. It was very white. It wasn't maybe self-aware about class. Just that show, it wasn't possible for it to be all things to all people.
Yeah, shall we get into some of the controversies, some of the things that tipped her down the mountain? Because there's a couple of interesting ones to revisit, I think. So she had a huge memoir deal with Random House. In 2014, her memoir came out, and they had paid $3.5 million for it. So there was a lot of excitement about that when it came out. And in it, she talks about being curious about her sibling's vagina when her sibling was a toddler. And she talks about opening it and putting some stones in there or some pebbles in there, and also trying to kiss her sibling on the lips.
When she was changing her sibling's nappy or something. And my memory is that she was only 3 or 4.
No,
she was 7 and her sibling was like 3 or
a toddler, yes. And so the alt-right, which was rising at the time, because we didn't even really have the phrase back then. I think we probably would have described them as sort of conservative provocateurs. But this rising alt-right really seized on these anecdotes as evidence that Lena Dunham was a sexual predator. And it might sound a bit absurd now, because her sibling spoke out and said this was not a problem, and this was she was a toddler, but it made no difference. It was really that was really the start of her fall from grace.
You know, you would never put that in a book now, right? Because it was those early years of when things were being weaponized. Offhanded comments. And Lena Dunham was very unfiltered. Her character was as well, but she was then called to sort of, as the voice of her generation, to speak about all these different things. And Girls it was back when there was more of a monoculture. Everybody would watch it, and every week there would be these big discussions. And it was also the rise of women's websites and blogs like Jezebel. So everything would be sort of picked apart every single week.
There was this quote by Kevin Fallon where he said it was the discourse apocalypse, which I think is a really good description of that.
All the hot takes.
Of that time. And the book, I think, fits into this what's worth acknowledging is that it was absolute cultural saturation, because while there was girls, there was also the memoir, the personal essay, which, has disappeared. People do not.
Well, and that was part of her breakthrough, was that disclosure, and women talking frankly about these most private things was seen as a liberation rather than sort of a liability.
Yeah. And then there was Lenny Letter, there was Women of the Hour, there was interviews, there was social media.
She was a podcaster early on.
Everywhere.
She's incredibly prolific. And it's interesting, Strife is set at this time too, very deliberately, because it was the beginning, it was the rise of women's media and a lot of women's voices in the media like Lena Dunham, but it was also the beginning of cancel culture, when the left started to be very censorious of particularly outspoken women.
And let's get to that also, the idea of, so we've talked about why the right kind of seized on her. She was a messy woman who was also, in their view, a sexual predator. On the left, there was also this rising sort of criticism of her. To pull out one episode, you mentioned Lenny Letter. That was her newsletter. And that was also, she's always been ahead of her time. Podcaster before her time, newsletter writer before her time. And in this newsletter, Lenny Letter, she wrote an essay once, a personal essay, about going to the Met Gala. And she wrote that she was sitting next to this football player called Odell Beckham Jr. And I'm just going to quote from it. "It was like we were forced to be together, and he literally was scrolling Instagram rather than have to look at a woman in a bow tie," because Lena had worn a bow tie to this Met Gala. "I was like, this should be called the Metropolitan Museum of Getting Rejected by Athletes." So the whole point was how fat and ugly she felt sitting next to Odell Beckham Jr., who was not interested in talking to her. This was at the time when intersectionality, not a new concept, but one which was rising in value and in prominence at the time. People felt like a white woman was saying that a black man, that she was entitled to attention and affection from a black man. And that was a real lightning bolt moment for the left.
Would you say, Amelia, that it's when, because she's always done a lot of personal disclosure, and so have authors and artists since the beginning of creativity. But it was the time when the personal was being very politicized. So everything she would say personally, whether it was about, exploring her, playing doctors with her sibling, or this personal experience of how she felt next to this man, suddenly everything was taken and overlaid with this political context that was often used to cancel her.
Well, and quite literally political, because the other thing I'm going to throw into this heady cauldron of cancel culture is Hillary Clinton. So 2016, she starts basically part-time to full-time campaigning for Hillary Clinton's presidential run. And there was that whole idea around then that this was going to be Hillary Clinton breaking the glass ceiling in her pantsuit. Remember Pantsuit Nation, this idea of women felt jubilant that finally they were going to get a woman in the Oval Office. And Lena really spent the year campaigning for her. Along the way, while she was on the campaign trail, she said that she wished she had an abortion. Another reason why the left did not love her. And of course, the left didn't really love Hillary Clinton. She was a centrist candidate who happened to be running for the left-wing party.
But I know what she was trying to say. Like, that is just such an example of how the conversation changed. So as part of her podcast, she'd done an episode about abortion, and someone asked her in an interview, "Have you ever had an abortion?" And she said, "No, I wish I had," but taken out of context, what she was trying to say is she was trying to be silly and, self-deprecating.
I think that what you're speaking to as well is that we didn't know how to take her, because she was this character. It was this classic
she kept putting her foot in her mouth, right?
To uncouple Hannah Horvath from Lena Dunham. I still think we don't quite know how to do that. And
that's why she's cast someone else as her in this new Netflix show.
And I think that activists now almost have to adopt this earnest tone, because if you are an activist, if you have something very serious to say about the world, you can never joke. So she would clumsily say things. She would joke about something that was very serious.
Because she's very funny.
She's very funny. And Girls was very funny.
Brilliant writer.
And so she'd say things tongue-in-cheek even on Girls that were then weaponized, because we were like, well, what are you about? Are you a feminist? Or are you – and it's how feminism became this like stick to beat women with, because sometimes she did. And she did make real mistakes. Like I think that I think it was just after the Me Too movement when someone was accused of.
Yeah, we should just talk briefly about that because that was, I think, the final nail in the coffin for Lena Dunham. The left and the right just couldn't handle her anymore. So what happened was in November 2017, so during the Me Too movement, there was a girls' writer named Murray Miller, a man, and an actress named Aurora Perrineau accused him of sexually assaulting her. This was back in 2012, but the allegation came out in November 2017. And Dunham responded to the accusations and she said, "Nope, I know him. He did not do this." She said, "While our first instinct is to listen to every woman's story, our insider knowledge makes us confident that this accusation is one of the 3% of assault cases that are misreported every year." Now, I remember reading that on Instagram. Do you?
Yeah, I do.
I think we talked about it at the time. And I was devastated because it just felt like a real betrayal. Yeah. And I don't identify with either the far left or the far right. But to me, she lost me in that moment. I have to admit.
Yeah, right.
She lost me. And I was a huge fan of hers. So then after that, she went very much to ground and she basically left the public eye. There were some health reasons for that. She had a hysterectomy due to endometriosis and she wrote about that very movingly, I think, for US Vogue. She also was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And so she does now identify and describe herself as chronically ill. She moved to London in 2021.
She went to rehab.
She went to rehab.
She was addicted to prescription medication. And she broke up a long-term relationship through almost the entirety of Girls. She was dating Jack Antonoff, who is Taylor Swift's co-collaborator.
Who's
Lord's
he with now?
co-collaborator. Margaret Qualley. He's married to Margaret Qualley. And that was a very defining relationship, obviously, in her life at a very defining time in her life. And there are a lot of biographical similarities. There's a character very similar to him in Too Much, which is also very interesting. But she's also very good friends with Taylor Swift, who she no doubt met through her relationship with Jack Antonoff and who she remains friends with to this day. Taylor Swift was actually at her wedding to...
She was a bridesmaid.
Yeah, to this musician, Louis Felder, who's her co-creator on Too Much. And she was part of, remember that whole squad, with the 1989 tour. It was all of these supermodels and Lena Dunham, and she spoke afterwards, even though she's still friends with Taylor, how that wasn't very good for her self-esteem.
Well, it wasn't very good for Taylor's self-esteem either. I mean, that they both suffered from eating disorders around that time that they've subsequently spoken about. So she moved to London. She made some films. None of them really hit. And now there's this.
She has I think it's a $55 million deal with Netflix. So she's made Too Much, which is a 10-episode series, which I assume will go to a second season because I think it's been pretty well received. She's also currently directing, I think it's a rom-com with Natalie Portman in New York called Good Sex. She's got a ton of different projects on the boil. I think she's so talented, like crazy talented. She's like one of the most talented creators of our generation.
She's a beautiful writer, and I suppose you can compare her almost to a Bo Burnham. He's a male comedian of the same sort of age, and he does something really interesting, which is he releases a special, whether it's stand-up, whether it's on Netflix like Inside, and then he disappears for years. Is that a privilege that's afforded to men? I don't know. But I was thinking about like your Jerry Seinfeld, your Larry David, your Ricky Gervais. I think that men are allowed to create, star in, develop these personas who are imperfect and funny and play with that in a way that we don't allow women to. I think there was a lot of misogyny, a lot of fat phobia in our treatment of Lena Dunham. I just think it's very interesting that she's been invited back to the party.
And I'm so glad she has.
What I'm loving about this is that Gen Z seems to be able to rediscover her and Girls without bringing the subsequent baggage to it. They can appreciate it as the brilliant show it was and celebrate her storytelling capacity without then having to assume that she has to mean something politically to them.